Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast, where we ignite the sparks of change and inspire a world free of racism. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting the most cutting-edge anti-racist research and education for the purpose of connecting practitioners to powerful research-based approaches to racial equity. I am your host, Dr. Tracey Benson, and today we invite you on a transformative journey as we delve into the efforts and triumphs of those dedicated to fostering racial equity within education. Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research Practice Podcast. Today, we have the opportunity to talk with esteemed scholar Dr. Darling-Hammond about his research on restorative practice, exclusionary discipline, and school policing. Dr. Darling-Hammond is an assistant professor of community health sciences at UC Berkeley's School of Public Health. His research explores how K-12 practices impact student mental health and seeks to identify policy pathways to expand health equity. Thank you so much for coming on our show today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So I just want to start off for our listeners, just to know who you are. I'm sure they can Google you a number of places and find out who you are. But if you want to introduce yourself to our practitioner community about who you are and how you came to do the work that you do.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to. And I just got to say, a lot of us in the ivory tower research spaces, we tend to get a little focused on the research side of things, on expanding knowledge. But what really gets me out of bed and I'm most passionate about is connecting with practitioners and those on the ground, making the hardest choices, doing the most important work to expand opportunity for the next generation. So I'm really happy to be here. And part of why I'm happy to be here is I spent time in a high school before I got my PhD, before I became a professor. I was helping to run Berkeley High School's restorative justice program for a couple of years. And that's where I got the passion for understanding what can create opportunities for students to have these positive transformative experiences, as well as trying to understand what drives them in the other direction. Because at the same time that I was running Berkeley's RJ program, I was also representing students in special ed hearings and representing them in juvenile hearings for the East Bay Community Law Center. So I was having these dual experiences of seeing school to prison pipeline flowing fast, but then these really positive transformative experience for youth who would have normally been suspended, but instead we're going through this really community embracing experience that changed their sense of themselves, changed their connection to school and to their peers. So after that, it was really just a matter of time before I figured out how I could make understanding how to make positive experiences the norm my career.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And for those who, we've heard this term. I don't know the inception of the term school to prison pipeline. It's been around what it seems like forever. Yeah. And you sound like you have a very granular understanding about what that actually looks like in terms of the courts being involved. What does that look like? If for someone who's I know the term myself too, and I can sort of see it when I was a school leader, but can you break it down in terms of what that means exactly?
Yeah, I'll break it down in terms of a specific kid. This is somebody who I met when I was at the East Bay Community Law Center, and his mom came in, and he had just been transitioned over to an alternative school. Which if folks aren't aware is kind of where a lot of kids end up when they've been expelled from sort of standard K-12 experiences and contexts, and they're put into a school that's better suited for their needs, which really means often a place where a lot of other expelled kids will be, and where the expectation isn't that students will necessarily get the most incredible educational experience, but they'll perhaps graduate. So anyway, he'd just been transitioned to an alternative school, and his mom was trying to help him figure out how to have his IEP, his educational rights, his special education rights sort of respected in that environment. So I went through his folder of experiences with his mom, and he had been suspended for the first time when he was in preschool, and then again in kindergarten, and then again and again. He kind of got into this this relationship with school where they always saw him as a bad kid. And so, I'm expecting, of course, seeing this sort of trajectory of suspensions, that he's going to be sort of just a lot of energy. And he's going to, something about this kid is going to make teachers want to suspend him in some way. Nope. I meet him. He is soft-spoken. He is quiet. He's got dreams for the future. He wants to connect with his peers. But for some reason, he's kind of gotten locked into this cycle of being excluded. And the exclusion may start off as a suspension. Maybe that particular day, that particular teacher didn't have the skills to sort of make sure that he can be part of the environment. But it becomes a cyclical thing, and then eventually they're being expelled. And if there's a school police officer in that environment, then they may get a school-based arrest. They may even get referred to law enforcement that's outside of the school environment, like a cop that's part of a police department that responds to stuff that happens in that school area. Eventually, they're going to be in a juvenile hearing, right? Because if you do certain things in schools, then under a zero tolerance paradigm, you're actually required to be tried, right? To be tried as having committed a misdemeanor or even a felony. And so now they're in juvenile hearings. And once they get in there, it's pretty dispiriting. Juvenile hearings last minutes, right? And so you've got this kid who this judge has never met. And ostensibly, this is supposed to be the moment where community members are able to sort of speak for this kid and say who they are, and their parents are able to speak for them, and their counselor is supposed to be able to speak for them and give a sense of who they are. And the judge is supposed to hear all that. But again, these last like minutes, like 5 minutes sometimes. And so the judge is going to look at this kid, look at what's on the paper, which is typically just some like recitation of the school rule that was broken and how that's related to the California Penal Code, and then make a really rapid decision. Are they going to juvie? Are they going home? Are they getting ankle monitoring? Whatever it is. And so I actually popped in at the time where we were trying to figure out the IEP stuff, but then I stayed on with this kid as he had a juvenile hearing. And in that juvenile hearing, I had gotten to know him. I got to know his dreams and his friends and his community. And I was like, there's no way he's going to end up in juvie. There's no way he's going to end up with an ankle monitoring because I'm going to make sure I speak on his behalf. I never had a chance. Judge didn't want to hear from us. So within seconds, he looked at the piece of paper. He said, you're going to go home with an ankle monitor. If you leave this little geographic region, you're going to go to juvie. And that's that. Boom, done. So now this kid has this like stigmatizing, dehumanizing ankle monitor on him for a week. And he became extremely depressed. So why am I saying all this? Because we talk about school to prison. We forget about what that does to kids' hearts, what that does to their sense of self. So in the course of all of these experiences, he went from being someone who'd been like suspended, but then he was someone who'd gone to juvie, to a juvenile hearing, and now he's got an ankle monitor, and now all of his peers are looking at him different. And at the back end of that, you know, it felt like, to me, it felt like my job was now not just about trying to get him out of this ankle monitor and help him sort of like get back into the classroom and back into a normal educational environment, but also help heal his heart. And it was a heavy, heavy job. Like his whole sense of who he was had shifted. So anyway, that's like school to prison as it is experienced by a kid or by an advocate of that kid. And it's rapid.
Yeah. And you talk about the exclusionary discipline in elementary school. What have you seen in terms of once a kid gets into that cycle, what is their mindset? You know, okay, I've done something, now I'm kicked out of school. And it becomes part of their sort of schema. Like I couldn't even imagine being suspended from school as a child, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know too many kids who were suspended, right? Maybe I knew one or two at middle school who got into a fight. But in elementary school, it was unthinkable until I became a teacher. I was like, people suspend out of school? What happens to a child when it happens to them so young?
Yeah, well, I'll say it's really sad. When a kid goes through that experience of being suspended, and this is me speaking both as somebody who's like worked with kids who are going through this, but also somebody who has a 5-year-old who's never been suspended, thank God. But like, I think about what will happen to him, given my understanding of his psychology, if he ever is excluded in that way. And when I try to help administrators think about this, I actually try to turn the question on its head and say, like, what would happen for you if you were in your workplace environment and you got in some kind of disagreement with a colleague and you were just kicked out? Grab your stuff. You're going to go home. You can't come back tomorrow. You can come back the next day, right? A 2-day out of school suspension, out of work suspension. What would happen for you? Would you feel like the relationship with the person you had that scuffle with was improved in any way? Would your behavior with them improve? Would they feel safer interacting with you? Would you feel like you were welcomed when you came back? What about all the gossip about you getting kicked out? And how would you feel coming back in knowing people were probably, you know, talking about you behind your back for 2 days, right? And I say all that because kids and adults are the same species, right? So like when we think about what would happen for a kid when they're out of school suspended, all we have to really do to get some amount of empathy is think, how would I feel if the exact same thing happened to me in a context that I'm more familiar with, right? And it's really a wild experience, right? To have to be told this is a place where you belong, but then you make one mistake that's, for whatever reason beyond the pale, it's like, you don't belong here anymore. And everybody knows it. You're an outsider. Get out. And then when you come back in, you're not really an insider because you know now that you can be kicked out, right? Like your sense of this is a space that I belong to, that I have some sort of connection to, where there's like this tacit agreement that I'm a member of this. It's gone. That sense that you're a member of that space is gone. So, what we see empirically is that it creates these negative cycles of dyadic interaction. So whatever teacher suspended that kid, now there's a sense of sort of defiance and distance. And it's dyadic, right? So it's not just that the student is feeling that, the teacher feels like this kid is a troublemaker and kind of gives up on the relationship. And the only way to really break that cycle is to help the teacher think about that relationship as something that can be improved with effort, and think it's their job to improve that relationship. So if they're suspending that kid, they see that as a failure of their effort to improve the relationship, rather than some manifestation of that child's, latently maladapted psychology or whatever it is, right? Like whatever label they have for that kid. And it is really unfortunate that once that label is set on the child by the adults, it becomes their own sense of themselves too, right? So it doesn't just impact their relationship with that teacher, but it also impacts the relationship with the entire school, with the other adults and the other kids, and eventually, as I've seen in a lot of more recent research, their relationship with themselves. They develop depression, suicidal ideation, like those things are much more common for kids who have been suspended, even one time, because of how much it means to us as a species to belong, and how impactful it is to feel like we are outsiders, we're excluded. This is not a space for us. So it's heavy, I know, but it's important to be honest about it.
No, it's important because I'm not a restorative person. We had to do anti-racism, but I was called on to do a workshop on restorative practice a while ago, and I took it there when you said I'm a parent, and I have a child that's been to school, and how would it feel? And the way I took it was similar, is that teachers develop sort of like a secondary caregiver relationship with your child. They're with us 180 days out of the year, all day long. We see during the week, as teachers, and I remember I was a fourth grade teacher, I would see my students much more than would see their own parent, right, during the school week, right? So we were a secondary caregiver. And being a parent, I would never kick my child out of the house.
Mm-hmm.
At any age, right? But especially at the tender elementary school age. Oh, if you made this mistake, that's not acceptable. I'm going to kick you out to stay with grandma for 2 days. If you do it again, you're going back over there again.
That's right.
Can't imagine the damage that would do for life. That would be a seared into their memory about the time they got given away because you no longer fit. And it's so sad that we still continue these practices. So if it's something that, it's widespread. It's widespread. The exclusionary discipline, maybe not so much in elementary anymore, but middle school and high school, definitely very much so. So who does exclusionary discipline work for then? Like what type of person gets a suspension or Saturday detention and they're like, okay, it really improved my trajectory? You have any insight on that?
Yeah, so the question presupposes that it works for anyone, right? Which I think is part of our... we have this latent belief, right? It's called the just world fallacy, that if something is happening, then it must be happening for a reason and it must be good, right? So I'll answer that in a second, but I just wanted to say something that kind of popped in my head as you were saying that, sort of like that feeling of how odd it is to exclude your child from your house and be like, beyond the pale, why would you do that, right? Two things popped in my head. One is, yes, teachers are caregivers, but they're also sort of the bridge for kids between how the world works and home, right? So like right now, if you think of like, what does a kid experience when they're 5? They haven't experienced the world yet, right? So a teacher is their sense of like, how does authority work? How does society work? And so when they're excluded from that, their sense of their connection to all of the things that aren't home is also being impacted. So like, I know you think about sociological theory a lot. That's one of the things that I think we have to remember when we think about like, what does school mean to a kid? It means this is how the world works. So being excluded from that space in some ways is almost more toxic, almost more impactful than if they were excluded temporarily from home, where they're like, well, then maybe home is a problem, but the rest of the world is okay. It's like, no, this is how the rest of the world works. I'm excluded from the world. It's like a pretty shocking thing. And the second thing that popped in my head, this came from a qualitative interview we just did with some folks. I can't say what school district because it's all, under lock and seal until it's published, but they were talking about how weird it is that we have cops in schools. And they said, if I wanted to make sure that my kids behaved, I wouldn't just have like a cop standing in the corner of our kitchen, making sure they follow the rules. But that's essentially what we do in schools if we think of schools as extensions of home. And that was, for me, that was kind of like a mind-opening thought of like, okay, yeah, I'd feel very strange inviting a police officer to be like the mechanism of authority and reminder of the rules in my house. But we've kind of gotten numb to that. By the way, to your question, Tracey, about like, does suspension work for anyone? And my pivot back to like, it presupposes that it works for anyone. So Bagley's treatise on suspensions in the 1920s is where a lot of our views, actually no, 1908, it's even earlier, is where a lot of our views on suspensions in schools come from. This idea that we, spare the rod, spoil the child, that if we exclude aggressively enough, that will shift behavior in positive ways. And that was rooted in a belief about psychology that has been roundly rejected. This idea that extrinsic motivators that work on animals will also work really well on people. And we now know that's actually not how our psychology is wired, that if we really want to encourage people to engage in certain behavior, we have to have a really thoughtful system of incentives and intrinsic motivators. We have to make sure that they feel like they are a member of the community. And so we sort of shifted workplaces accordingly. We haven't actually shifted schools. We're still stuck in this idea that if we exclude aggressively enough, we'll get what we want, right? So like zero tolerance was rooted in this view of human psychology that is like we've really moved on from. Like for decades, we've moved on from it. And so I think sometimes society moves a little slower when it comes to kids because kids don't vote. Kids can't force us to change things. Kids also don't have the awareness of whether or not something is structurally incongruent with their own experiences because they don't have that awareness. So, I pivot that because I don't think that exclusionary discipline actually works better than the alternative for any kid. It's just that it's so pervasive that it's hard to imagine shifting away from it, but so incrementally. So anyway.
Yeah. And I hear the inertia of how these schools, I forget who the author was or who the scholar was. They say, if you fast forwarded, another 200 years or went back to 200 years, the one institution that would probably be recognizable to us would be schools.
Yeah.
Because it's so static in the inertia of how we construct these places for children, as you say, who don't have a lot of political power or even voice, that it's a place to put them. And it's often the last area that evolves with society.
Sounds like that, but I'm not sure. Sounds right.
There you go.
Of schools to me, but probably there's more than one scholar who said something like that.
Right. I mean, it's very true. When I look at pictures from, the 1900s, the 1800s, I mean, it's still row by row, students sitting being obedient, textbooks, which are replaced now by laptops or iPads. And it's very similar to how we've always done things. And so you mentioned SROs. I want to go there after this question, because I want to get into restorative practice. I'm just going to play the role of folks who approach me around restorative practice, teachers and school leaders. And they're like, this is just watering down the rules. Like, what do we do? They catastrophize. Like, our school is going to be a zoo. Kids are going to game the system. They're just going to come and say sorry when they have restorative circles.
Right.
And they're not really going to change their behavior. So unless we, at what point in time do we have the right to use exclusionary discipline? These are all the things that come out in terms of folks who don't quite understand the concept, but the idea of not having punitive discipline is just a complete catastrophe to them.
Yeah. Well, I'll say it's not wrong to imagine that that's a possible outcome. I think that's very important to say, right? Mm-hmm. If the version of restorative practices that is implemented in schools is something that feels like a Band-Aid on a hatchet wound, then you're going to get some negative externalities, right? If it's like, listen, kid, you made a mistake. Normally I'd suspend you. I don't even really know your name. I don't like you, but you have to sit in the circle for 30 minutes, say sorry the right way, and then you can go back to what you want. Yeah, you're not going to get the kind of behavior change, the kind of community building. You're not going to get any of the benefits of it because what you're doing isn't restorative practices, right? And a lot of places end up doing it in a very perfunctory way because it is a command from up top with no support. So I just want to say out loud, if you hear horror stories about any education policy, frankly, it's probably because we are in a context of rapid panacea hopping with limited support, where we have a lot of leadership that will tell you, you're doing this now. I'm not really sure what it is, but you have to do it. And they don't really have the time to structurally support it or to sustain the work to implement it effectively. And so the teachers end up being on the front lines of sort of like poorly thought out policies. And so I just want to say out loud, like, that's a real thing. And I've seen that happen. It is unfortunate. It's unfair, right? But if we're thinking about what happens when a school implements thoughtful, intentional restorative practices and what that looks like, it actually involves more accountability for students, right? It is easier to break a school rule and have to go to an in-school suspension detention or to be out of school suspended. There's no accountability. You don't have to apologize to anybody, introspect, feel anything, do anything, fix anything. That is easier for a kid than to be like, you hurt someone and you broke something. You have to fix that thing. And you have to think about how you can empathize with the person that you've harmed and try to fix that relationship. That takes emotional effort and that takes time. And that emotional effort and time is exactly what we want kids to be doing so they can build the empathy, introspection, the social connections, the ability to fix things they've broken, and the awareness that that little moment where they lost their cool had a huge impact on their community. That's what builds the sense that maybe I don't want to lose my cool so much, and the desire to work with their trusted adults to figure out how they can make sure they don't make those mistakes in the future. Now, you heard there are a lot of things in there that have to be in place. Trusted adults, the time and space to introspect, the ability to connect socially with somebody who you've made a mistake with, right? The ability to fix the mistake if the mistake is material. All of that has to be in place. And that's not something you can just turn on if you've been in an environment that's been intentionally punitive and exclusionary for years, decades, you know? So yeah, I think it's understandable that folks catastrophize it because there's a version of it that is a catastrophe, right? If you're implementing restorative practices in a fundamentally punitive context where folks don't have relationships and aren't really invested in them, it's probably not going to work. But if instead it's like, this is part of our shift where we say we are a relationship-oriented environment. Everybody's going to know kids' names. We're going to make sure those kids feel like we care about them, that they belong. Exclusion is no longer something we're jumping to because we know that's harmful for them and we love them. We care for them. We want them to be part of this. So how can we make sure they're included? How can we make sure that we are creating a paradigm where they want to behave because they feel connected, right? How can we do that? That's a lot more work, but the fruit it bears is so sweet. And so the three districts that I recently worked with in a project called Where and How Exclusionary Discipline Disappeared, they're all districts that that educate Black children and have really low suspension rates for students of all backgrounds. And I went in kind of agnostic. I wasn't sure what practices they were using, and I was open to whatever. And they were all using restorative practices paired with social and emotional learning and positive behavioral interventions and supports. And they're using them in this intentionally synergistic way where the staff were getting training on how to develop positive relationships with each other and with the kids. They were getting training in how to create sort of these positive behavioral cycles where they were sort of rewarding good behavior and they were lifting up students for doing the right thing instead of putting students down for doing the wrong things, right? That's SEL, that's PBIS. But then they were also getting training in how to repair relationships when harm had occurred. So it wasn't just like, let's throw a sort of practice in the mix here. It was like, we need to figure out how we can create a relationship-oriented, inclusive, radically inclusive space. And it was amazing, right? Like kids were so happy to be there. And not only did you see like these massive declines in suspensions and no expulsions, mind you, none, like zero, but you also saw this incredible flourishing in academics, in kids coming to school, in parental engagement. And it's hard, but it's worth it.
Right. Wonderful. And I often, thank you for that. They're a very detailed explanation, right? It's not just taking one part of it and putting it into a context that's wholly bought into independent on exclusionary discipline that it's not going to fit. And that's what we've seen, right? They try it for a couple of months. It's not working. The children aren't remorseful. They put it in a paradigm of punitive, but try to be restorative without a full buy-in of everyone in the building. And what I also say to principals is that, and they're like, all right, we have, X amount of suspensions. We want to get down to this. And when we start doing the data analysis on who, what, when, and how, we find that there are teachers who do this naturally already in every school, right? It's just a part of their ethos, right? It's not foreign. You have teachers all along the way in every building across the U.S. who they won't call it restorative. It's just very good relationship building and great practice to sort of engage with kids. I read the book, The Marva Collins Way. And she didn't name it restorative practice. This is just how you build community with kids. And so it's not a foreign concept, but to scale it, as you say, takes a lot more work.
Yeah, I love that you said that. And it's so true. I sometimes think about like the warmest classroom experience that any of us has had. You know, if you think back to when you were a kid and you think of that one teacher who you felt like really had your back, and you think about what kind of teacher you want your kid to have, probably someone like that, right? So when we think about kind of what would be the ideal situation for the next generation of kids, if all of them were ours, we want them all to have a restorative teacher, somebody who like really cares about them, has a strong relationship, has those relational tools. So when they make mistakes, they're warm, they can redirect in these really artful ways. Like that's what we want. But when we think about this in a broad structural sense, there's this temptation to think punitively because that's just like the air we breathe. It's what we've sort of inherited over generations of social science not catching up, or society not catching up with social science. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting that folks say, well, this is how the world works. If they break a law, they're going to have consequences.
That's right. I
that
need my
they have
pound
to
of flesh.
learn.
Unless it's hurt kids, right? And then it's like, well, but think about, and they didn't have breakfast. And like, of course, yeah, there's context. We should always think about how to learn and think about the context for all the kids.
And the empathy part with teachers is that most teachers don't have the skill set. It's not like they don't want to, right? They're thinking about how they want each one of their children to feel who come through that classroom door. I mean, that's the majority of teachers have that heart to that they want. If it was their child, they want to be the teacher that they would want their child to have. And I often think that our toolboxes aren't equipped, especially through teacher preparation, to equip us to be more restorative rather than punitive. It's often just glossed over and sacrificed for like pedagogy and instruction and data, right? So I think it's the empathy piece where this is not yet a part of the broader scope of ideology when preparing a teacher yet.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And, that's one of the things that struck me in an interview I had with superintendent and assistant superintendent. They're both in that interview in one of these 3 school districts. They have like really high academic performance, right? So you'd think that their professional development is probably all about pedagogy of, teaching this classroom topic, and that it's not. They actually completely flipped it on its head, and they called it Maslow before Bloom. The idea was we need to make sure that our teachers are prepared to meet students' basic psychological needs and create a really rich and deep foundation of psychological safety. And then we can do the Bloom stuff, the taxonomy of learning, all the things that are about content. Because if they don't have that, and when we say they, I mean every kid, if they don't have that foundation of psychological safety, then you're not going to be able to tend to the sort of conceptual richness of the curriculum, because you're going to have students who are just not in a place to learn. And we know that from like a lot of the last couple decades of research about the importance of psychological safety to create the sort of cortisol reactivity that you want, not too high, and positive responses to stress. Like we know all of this from studies of people and animals. Like if you really want the brain to be turned on, there's a contents for it. We should create schools that allow for that, right? So anyway, when they did that, they ended up seeing that their academics that were already pretty high continued to go up. And they did that for all the kids, which is just, I find that so powerful. The idea that if you can really create a paradigm where kids feel good, where their brains are able to be at their best, that you will see cognitive flourishing. And from that, you will see conceptual learning and mastery and all the things you want to see on standardized tests as well. And it makes sense to me, right? But I think it's hard to get there.
Right. I'm glad that you put that out there. That's more than just your instructional capabilities, right? There's much more that goes into teaching and learning as far as your classroom and a broader school environment. So the last thing I have for you, and I'm just going to put it out there as a phrase, right? Because I don't want to sort of sway either way. I think I know what you're going to say, but I want this to be something for the podcast, but also I think it's going to be very useful as sort of a short and a clip that we use, that we put on social media for folks just to access. And just a concept of school resource officers. So post George Floyd, there was this real reconciliation with race and also the utility of school resource officers. And a lot of school districts went wholesale away from SROs, right? And we're also seeing now an influx about a lot of school districts bringing them back.
Right.
So what are your perspectives on school resource officers?
I will quote the title of a piece that we're finalizing now. And this is from an interviewee who is in a school district that removed school resource officers and they've sort of stayed the course. And they said safety is more than just policing. And so their perspective was, if you really want your school to be a place where kids are and feel safe, you cannot rely on guns and cuffs, because guns and cuffs don't change behavior. Guns and cuffs don't form relationships. Guns and cuffs don't make kids want to be their best selves. They just make kids scared. And we know fear does not lead to the kinds of behavior, the kinds of environments, the kinds of learning, the kinds of communities that we want, truly that we want. And so something that I've been thinking a lot about is the strategic removal of school police a precondition for creating the kinds of environments where kids can really feel safe and like they belong. Now, I'm not sure. It may be that there is a version of things where you can have school security officers that are so immersed in the culture of relationships, and they're so sort of like connected to kids in ways that are positive and uplifting and make kids feel safe, truly safe in their hearts, that it's possible. But I don't think that is the ethos with which most school districts hire school police officers, where the idea is to make sure that all the kids feel truly in their hearts that they're safe, right? So I would say safety is more than just policing. And if you truly care about your kids feeling and being safe, you have to think about how school police fit within the overall ecosystem of what you're doing and whether they fit in that ecosystem at all.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Very diplomatic answer too. Fantastic, right? Because I've noticed a lot of these debates have gone for or against. I'm like,
yeah, we don't know. I mean, the reality is we're figuring it out. But my bet is that for many more contexts than realize, their school policing paradigm is in the way of creating the best option for safety for their kids. I don't know. I think we need to study it and figure it out. But that's my bet.
Right. And I've seen that when often they'll use these anecdotal sort of examples from these certain school resource officers that are there. They're part of the community. They're supporting kids. They're mentoring. They have an after school like basketball leagues. I'm like, okay, that's the personality. They happen to be a school resource officer, right?
Right.
They're providing an environment for students to feel safe, feel heard, feel seen, feel that they can have a trusted person to go to. This doesn't have to be a person with a gun and the ability to arrest.
That's right.
They're functioning as like a community resource. And so it's not for or against. I think we can think about the characteristics, right, that we're actually looking for and come to some happy middle ground. And often it will not have to be someone with cuffs and a gun.
Yeah.
Right.
Couldn't agree more.
Awesome. So if people want to follow you, if people, enjoy your work as I do, right? I have you on my notifications on Google Scholar, one of many that pop up, right?
Appreciate it, man.
So everyone that I admire their work, as soon as I heard you speak, I think I knew of you before, but I went back as a guest. You're one of the scholars that I follow. And so if you want to follow Dr. Sean Darling-Hammond, you can go on Google Scholar, find his work, and just indicate that you'd like to be notified when his work comes out as noted by Google Scholar. But where else can people go if they would like to follow you or your work?
I post occasionally on LinkedIn, but primarily I think Google Scholar is the way to go. And as things come out, I tend to try to be intentional about getting it out there in practitioner-facing places like CASA. Sometimes I present at California California Association of African American Superintendents and Administrators, as well as sometimes putting out reports at Learning Policy Institute or Policy and Advocacy for California Education. So I try to get out there. So yeah, Google Scholar is a great way to keep up with my work.
Wonderful,
and you can always reach out to me as well. If anything I'm saying is of interest, if you're looking for professional development, SeanDH@berkeley.edu. I love working with practitioners. As I said, I feel like y'all are the ones actually doing the work. So if I can be part of your journey and helping to make sure that you are able to serve our next generation of youth, I am honored to do so.
Wonderful. And I know the research, and I've had the opportunity to be in the audience, and he's very dynamic, very convincing, as you can see through the podcast. So this has been the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research to Practice podcast with Dr. Sean Darling-Hammond. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to reading more of your work.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast. Remember, the fight against racism starts with each and every one of us. Together, we can create inclusive environments in our schools that celebrate diversity and empower all students. For more information, visit our website at antiracisminstitute.com and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time as we continue to shine a light on the champions of change. Stay inspired, committed, and let's make a difference together.